This is Cut to the Chase. My name is Sylvester Rivers. We're speaking with Paul Kivel. Paul Kivel is a social justice educator, activist, and writer whose work spans over 5 decades in community education, engaged parenthood, political writing, and practical activism. So he's still a young man, over 5 decades. Kivel works for a collective healing, transformation, and justice. He asks us, how can we live and work together to nurture each individual and create a multicultural society based on love, caring, justice, and interdependence with all living things? We're going to see if that's possible. Hopefully you have an answer. I wanted to talk to you because of a book I read several years ago. His book is called Uprooting Racism. I guess it's updated. How white people can work for uprooting racism, how white people can work for racial justice.
Right.
That's their book. Okay. So then, I did look at the Living in the Shadows of, that's a newer book you have. And the original book that I read was, like I said, several years ago, and we could not find a copy anywhere, so I had to go look at it or peruse it on the internet, which I do not like doing. I like to have a hard copy in my hand, so that was somewhat challenging. So, Paul, you are a white guy, but from appearance, which you never can tell, but you wrote this book, Uprooting Racism, How White People Can Work for Racial Justice. But Mike, aren't we in the post-racial period and there's no racism existing?
Well, that would be wonderful, wouldn't it? And I think we would all feel very different if that was true. Actually, we're seeing an intensification of white supremacy in the national level, the political level, the economic level, and then just in the street level in terms of housing, in terms of medical care, in terms of police brutality. We're far from a post-racial society. That's a mantra that some white people would like to believe is true. And in fact, some white people, particularly Christian nationalists, are saying we've gone too far in terms of racial justice and we have to backtrack because we granted too many rights to people of color.
Wow. So on this book, very interesting, as I recall, and that's why I wanted to talk to you. But you, I guess, when I read the book, one of my thoughts was that he gets it. He gets it. A lot of people don't get it. And you mentioned some things about racism. It says interpersonal racism. These are types of racism that you mentioned in your book. Institutional racism, structural racism, and cultural racism. So those are some of the things that you outlined. Do you want to speak? Let's start with the first one, interpersonal racism. What is interpersonal racism and why did you write about that?
Well, interpersonal racism is what is all of us have prejudices. Our society raises us with a lot of misinformation about other people. So prejudices are things that we, as responsible adults, we have to overcome. We have to relearn. We have to understand better. But if I have some power over a person of color, because I'm a police officer or a teacher or a doctor or a landlord or whatever, I can act out an interpersonal act of discrimination, of abuse. And that's what I mean by the interpersonal level, not just prejudice, but the ability to take that prejudice and hurt people of color, to exploit people of color in some way.
That's very interesting because Dr. Joy DeGruy says something like that. She says black people can't be racist because racism gives you the power to affect other people. And in a sense, that's where you're going with this. Is that correct?
That's right. All of us can be prejudiced because we have so much information, misinformation, but it takes some power with that prejudice or misinformation to commit an act of interpersonal racism. Now, unfortunately, that's the level that mostly people in this country understand racism. Somebody did something discriminatory or made a comment or something, and that was racist and that's bad. But that's just the first level, the kind of most visible level. The institutional level is the level at which organizations, institutions, policies, procedures have built into them unequal impacts on people of color and people who are white. So, in other words, I can be a teacher in a school system and treat all my students well. I can be a white teacher and treat all the white students, students of color, everybody equally, support them. But if I'm teaching in a school that tracks white students into higher academic tracks, that disciplines more harshly students of color, and has textbooks that have a racially inaccurate portrayal of U.S. history, then regardless of my personal prejudice or not, or power or not, I'm teaching in an institution that's perpetuating racism, that's abusing students of color in this case. So we have to look at that, because that is true in all of our institutions, whether they're educational or medical or housing or work, employment. The institutions have built into them legacies of racism and discrimination.
Wow. So I'm going to ask you this. I want to read a quote from your book, but I guess before I do that, I'm going to ask you, why did you write this book?
I wrote the book because I'm committed to justice. I'm committed to living a life of integrity in which my life is not based on the exploitation of other people. And when I think about who made my clothes, who made my cell phone or computer, who grew or worked in the fields to harvest the food that I eat, I realize that my life is living on the exploitation of many people around the world, primarily people of color, and that I have a responsibility to care for the injustices that are happening around me, that are in my name, that I benefit from. I also realize that when racism is a way of dividing white people from people of color so that we can't work together to actually change these institutional systems. It makes white people fear people of color rather than seeing people of color as natural allies. And we've seen this over and over again historically in the labor movement and in other kinds of organizing where the ruling class uses racism. Right now we see it with the way immigrants are being targeted and abused and deported. That divides us from working together to actually change the system and eliminate the injustices that we're all experiencing.
Wow. There's so much I'm going to ask you, and I'm all over the place, but I want to read this, but I'll read that later. So you talked about other people, the others, and the discriminating. So let's just, since we're right now in 2025, looking at what's going on around the world, there's wars. Do you think racism plays a part in what's going on in, say, Gaza, where it's okay for those folks to be killed? Do you think that's a part of it?
Absolutely. White supremacy is a global system. It comes out of colonialism. The state of Israel was originally set up by white Christian nationalists in Britain, who divided Palestinians from Jews and made contradictory promises to both groups about having territory in what is now Palestine and Israel. There's a racial hierarchy within Israeli society where Ashkenazi Jews from Europe, white-skinned Jews, have a lot of the economic power, a lot of the political power, and Jews of color from other parts of the world, either the Middle East or Africa or wherever, are discriminated against and have a less influence, less human rights. And so, yeah, racism is not just a U.S. problem; it's an international problem, and it has particular histories in each country.
Mm-hmm. So you are Jewish too, right?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so I've talked on this show, Cut to the Chase, many times about how right now I see it like what you just mentioned, this white nationalism under the guise of anti-Semitism.
Mhm.
Would you agree with that? And when I say that, what I'm saying is that this whole, I mean, Netanyahu, who was, I think, from Eastern Europe, didn't speak Hebrew, came and the whole thing is about, seems to be white nationalists. As you mentioned, they discriminate against the Falasha Jews in Israel. So is this move that we're seeing as and branded as anti-Semitic really more about white nationalism? Or am I?
Absolutely. The anti-Semitism has become a screen for attacking not just Palestinians and not or Palestinian Americans or Arab Americans, but any of us who are protesting on social justice issues or international solidarity. I would say it's not. I would amend it to say it's white Christian nationalists because very much this is an organized by Christian Zionists and other Christians who have an agenda in the Middle East that has to do with an end time scenario of and the apocalypse and the coming of Jesus. And so there's a tremendous attempt to support Israel and to eliminate any dissent here. But we have to understand that Christianity is a fundamental root of white supremacy. White supremacy grows out of dominant Christianity over the centuries.
Okay, you said a lot there, and I want to make sure that our audience and myself understand what you just said, because you talked about the biblical. Actually, I guess Israel was supposedly founded on the concept that we are God's chosen people. Correct. Therefore, this is ours, and I think that's still going on today. And you're saying the Christians believe in the. Would you just detail that more? They believe in the second coming of Jesus. Therefore, this must be the right Jews. Is that what you're saying? This must be. They must be correct.
Well, the narrative is that in order for Jesus, the end times to come, Jews have to be reassembled in Israel, gathered together. And this was the agenda of British Christian nationalists way back in the early 20th century, that part of their wanting to gather Jews in Israel was because of this end times narrative, that's a precursor to the coming of Jesus and the end times and the beginning of the end times. Now, there were motivations as well. They wanted to get Jews out of England, and they wanted an imperial outpost in the Middle East. And this was a good way to set up a European-controlled country in Palestine. But Christian Zionists supply tremendous amounts of money and support to Israel, including to all the settlements in the West Bank and other things, because this fits their agenda. Now they're using the false claim that they're protecting Jews, and that anybody who is pro-Palestinian is anti-Jewish. Well, those of us who are Jewish, who are pro-Palestinian, we've then become self-hating Jews, right? And it's another way of controlling dissent, of interrupting the narrative that it's okay what Israel is doing.
So I guess in order for the prophecy to be correct, this must be the case. The prophecy in the Bible that will come
Right.
back. Yeah.
And the irony is that in the prophecy, when Jesus returns, a whole lot of Christians will be carried away to heaven, but Jews will be left behind. And
On earth.
in the apocalypse, along with everybody else who isn't carried away because they're a good Christian. So it's not for the benefit of Jews. It's the benefit for Christians that they're supporting Israeli policy.
Okay, very interesting. You also in your book talked about you hit on it, institutional racism. But I want to read. Let's skip that. Go to cultural racism. I want to read a passage out of your book, and I think this would be under cultural racism. It says Annie Barnes recounts the following interview with a parent who noticed how early in their lives white children learn racism. She says, I experienced it being racism, through my 3-year-old daughter. One day at preschool, the students had a show and tell. All the students had brought their toys to school. My daughter forgot her toys, so I had to go home and get them. My daughter told me specifically what to bring. She wanted her pretty black Barbie doll with the white dress. She loved this doll and thought that it was pretty and often said, when I grow up, I want to look just like my Barbie. I do remember when they weren't black, the Barbies, by the way.
Right.
All the other children were white in her classroom. While my daughter brought out her Barbie during show and tell, they screeched and they screwed up their faces and said, yuck, that's not Barbie. She's ugly. She cried for hours, she being the daughter, and never carried her doll to school again. I couldn't believe those little children's action. That was racism by babies, so to speak. Your comments on that passage and what did it teach us or teach you?
Well, it's a tremendously painful passage, obviously. I can only begin to imagine how devastating it is for a black child to learn that their skin color is ugly, in quotes, but yet we know that this is true, that this happens a lot, that there's been lots and lots of studies around the dolls that little kids prefer. And often it's the white doll, even if it's a child of color. So what this, to me, says is that we don't even start talking about race with our children in school until way, way later, right? And if we're white, we probably don't talk with them at all. But children of color are learning at a very early age how racism works. And white children are too, because they're internalizing this hierarchy that white is prettier, white is better. And that gets reinforced over and over again through, you look at books, you look at the Learn to Read series, you look at any of the things going on in our schools, and these are still the lessons that they get, as well as in the TV and movies that they see.
So you would classify that under your cultural racism category?
Part of cultural racism, the way that this whole system gets reinforced constantly through the culture, through our religious and educational and media formats.
Okay, you know what? I want to play something for you. This is a debate between Brianna Joy Gray and Kirk.
Welcome to another episode of Debate Night. We're joined by founder of Turning Point USA, Charlie Kirk, and former press secretary to Bernie Sanders, journalist and co-host of Bad Faith podcast, Brianna Joy Gray. Tonight's topic is systemic racism in America. I'll start with you, Brianna. Can you start with your opening statements, please?
Sure. Well, thank you, Charlie, for the invitation. I'm glad to be here. Look, there are a lot of things that people struggle with in this country every day. 40% of Americans, even before this pandemic and the economic crisis that has accompanied it, couldn't respond to a $400 emergency. If we think of what that means, and we think of all of the emergencies that can come up that exceed $400 in cost, whether it's making rent, whether it's a medical bill, whether it's bailing someone out of jail, you can imagine a lot of circumstances that are really life-changing if you can't come up with that $400. And I just wanted to start by saying that because sometimes I think the conversations that we have, especially kind of in our professional context on the internet where there's a lot of different incentives to talk about a lot of different things, sometimes miss the forest for the trees. And so why I think conversations about systemic racism are ultimately important is because it's one factor among the many, the tapestries of things that are causing people not to be able to fully maximize their ability in our society. And I think people across the political spectrum talk a lot about freedom. It's one of our founding ideals as Americans. But I think often we talk about the freedom to do what we want affirmatively and not the freedoms from the restrictions that come when you aren't able to have your basic needs met. Have your basic housing needs, basic food needs, basic education needs, the things that you need to succeed. And for some cohort of Americans, systemic racism has been a barrier. And we need to talk about systemic racism because in a lot of people's imaginations, racism exists as, a bad guy in a Klan's hood and these kind of stereotypes, very explicitly denying people service, explicitly denying people a right to use the bathroom, the kind of racism that we understand from the 1960s. What we understand exists today is the aftershocks of a lot of those systems that were in place, not just interpersonal racism that existed at the time, but also the laws on the books that had real effects in terms of how people were able to grow and aggregate wealth at that time, and which has implications for the generations that have come since. So if you think about someone like myself, who's a relatively young person whose parents were born before the Civil Rights era, were born in the Civil Rights era before civil rights were secured for Black Americans in this country. We're not talking about something long, long ago and far, far away. We're talking about laws in the books that prevented my relatives who served in wars from getting the same benefits in terms of low-interest GI loans to buy property that white Americans got. And that has a trickle-down effect in terms of how much wealth has been amassed by my community as compared to others. And I think it's not about blaming people. It's not about hierarchies of oppression. It's just about understanding that this is how the world was, and snapping our fingers and getting rid of those prohibitive laws isn't going to change the effects of those prohibitive laws unless we do so affirmatively.
Okay. Thank you, Brianna. Can we move on to Charlie?
Yeah, I'll make it short. I don't think systemic racism exists, so the burden of proof's on you. There's racism, individual racist, it's disgusting, reprehensible. We'll agree on that. But the systems themselves are not racist. There's nothing that I can do that you can't do. You went to Harvard. It's pretty awesome. I didn't. So that's not a racist country. So, yeah, the burden's on you to prove it.
Charlie, is it your belief that if there is one example of something, that an anomalous example proves the rule?
No, not always, but can you name one example?
Of systemic racism?
Yeah.
So what did you think about the example I brought up in my opening remarks, the example of housing discrimination and redlining?
Like redlining? Yeah. So
with redlining?
You know Thomas Sowell's treatise on redlining?
I don't.
Yeah, you should read it.
What does it say? Are you able to tell me this moment?
Yeah, it's actually right here. He said, redlining, do you know that whites were turned down for mortgages more than Asians?
I'm unclear what relevance that has to
because it wasn't racially based. The redlining myth, according to Thomas Sowell, which I'm sure you believe in, says, quote, nor did either the mainstream media or political leaders ever mention the fact that black-owned banks turned down black mortgage loan applicants at least as often as white-owned banks did. Why were blacks turning down their own people?
I don't know what you're talking about. I'm talking
Obviously
about it.
you don't, because this is the fact.
Charlie, I would like to be very specific here.
I was just very specific.
So I'm talking about the GI Bill, which allowed people who had served in our wars, including a lot of Black Americans, to come back and get
you're talking about redlining, right? So this is redlining.
This is connected to redlining.
No, which one do you want to talk about, GI Bill or redlining?
If you allow me to explain, this is connected to redlining.
Okay.
I guess you don't understand that, but I'm happy to explain it to you right now if you just let me get this out. I promise you it'll be worth the effort. The GI Bill gave low interest loans to people who had served in the war. right? And those loans were issued by, they were federally backed loans. So the banks would issue to people at a low interest rate so that they could buy homes and generate what we now understand to be the basis of middle class wealth in this country. What ended up happening was the process of redlining was that banks said, oh, we're only going to issue loans for you to buy in certain neighborhoods.
Right, black banks.
All banks.
Right, so why did
Charlie,
black banks do that?
The overwhelming majority of issuers in this country...
No, you got to answer the question. Why did black banks do that?
I will answer your question. But what I'm talking about is the overwhelming majority of issuers, just like today, even more so back then, the overwhelming majority of issuers were white-owned banks. And those banks redlined communities where they said, we will not issue to people who live in these communities. Now, what ended up happening, what that meant for black people, was because of what's called a restrictive covenant, which meant that in the law, in the covenant that attached to the land for a lease, many of them precluded black people from buying in those neighborhoods. So basically what happened was banks would only lend to people and give those low interest loans to people who were allowed to.
So I thought that was interesting because people, to me, are in denial. She good. You went to Harvard or Yale, see? And people do that as far as black celebrities. Look, Oprah made it, so it's not racist. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, and of course, the ultimate example people use was President Obama, right? We have a black president. What else could possibly be demanded of us, right?
Right.
I think there are two things that are important. One are the facts are the facts. I mean, you can look at housing discrimination. You can look at the discrimination in our schools, in the medical care that people get. You can look at it in terms of police brutality and incarceration rates. And it's undisputable, if you are open to looking at the facts, that racism is systemic and widespread and a part of the foundations of our society. It's built into the Constitution. It's built into our laws. And if somebody has an agenda where they are white and are in power in some way and they want to keep that privilege, then it's in their best interest to deny it. And it's not going to, you can't argue them out of that. And that's why it's more than a interpersonal issue. You have to change those institutions, and that takes organized power. That takes collective power. That takes people of color and white people coming together to actually change those institutions.
Right. So you're talking about changing those institutions, and your book, How White People Can Work for Racial Justice. So that is very interesting. So that's a solution-oriented thing. So tell us some ways that white people can work for racial justice.
Okay. I think, though, but before I do that, I just want to talk about the structural level of racism, which you mentioned earlier, but we haven't talked about, because it's cumulative. If you face racism in the school system and your parents face racism in housing discrimination, and the whole family experiences racism from the police or from the medical profession in terms of getting access to health care, that there is an accumulative impact where those institutions work together to create a web that's very difficult to break. And so we talk about a school to prison pipeline, where the schools neglect children of color, push them out of the schools, and then they get caught up by the police and they get charged and sentenced unjustly and unfairly and disproportionately, and they end up in prison. So that's the school system, the institutions of schools, the institutions of jails and prisons and the police, and housing comes in there too, the institution of housing with the neighborhoods people live in. And so structural racism is about the cumulative impact of these things, because you can fix little pieces of it, but you really have to understand the power of the whole system of racial capitalism.
Well, you also have institutional racism. So you're saying structural and systemic are similar. What's the difference between institutional racism and structural racism?
Well, institutional racism is a racism in an institution of our society, like the educational system or the criminal legal system or the medical system. The structural level is how they interact and reinforce each other and accumulate even more drastic impacts and disparities.
Okay, so let's move forward. So with all this being said, and I was listening to that debate between Brianna Joy Gray and Charlie Kirk. A lot of stuff he's saying, it just wasn't correct.
Yeah.
You know, but I think that's what we're seeing now. Just well, I'll say it, blatant lies. I mean, like you said, studies and study after study after study shows the discrimination. But how, you know, how do we, as a white person, get white people, can they work for racial justice?
Well, I think there's different levels the first level obviously is that we, as white people, we need to be aware of how racism operates, how white supremacy plays out in our society, both in terms of giving us privilege and access and denying that privilege and access and actually being exploitive and abusive to people of color.
But then you have those white people say, I don't have much. I'm working hard. I lost my job. So that doesn't affect me. What would you say to that?
Well, I would say two things. One is that we're all in this together. We're all being exploited, except those who have accumulated the billions of dollars of power and wealth that make the decisions in all of our lives.
I see. Yes.
We can't ignore class and the system of capitalism. And if you're a poor white person, your exploitation is not going to end until you come together with the rest of us to challenge that tremendous inequality of wealth and power. So that's, on the one hand, that's true. The other is that there are benefits to being white. If you ask most white people whether they want to be white or would they be a black person, they're going to choose white because they know intuitively that it's better to be white. You know, they're going to be treated more respectfully by a landlord or by the police. They're going to have more opportunities for their kids than if they were black or brown or Asian American. So there are benefits to being white, and all of us are being exploited by a ruling class that is using racism to divide us.
Yeah, and I think you say white people see people of color as outsiders also, even though, you know, we say sometimes that a lot of white people would not rather have nothing to see somebody else get more than what they have. In other words, voting against your own interest. Well, you can't have that because I am the one, I'm the superior, I'm the American exceptionalist. Does that make sense? Or do you think it's true? Because why would people vote against their own interest?
Well, I think that it's more complicated than that because often that's a Democratic versus Republican kind of election scenario. And the Democratic Party has not been particularly responsive to the needs of working class white people, much less people of color. So most people don't vote. It's not that they're not voting against their interests. They realize the system is broken, and none of the current choices we get are going to fix that because they're part of that system. They're men of wealth, and whether they're white or the exceptional black person, they're not going to address these inequalities that are devastating our communities.
Wow. So I think that's where you see the game that some of the conservatives or rights are playing. Like we're on your side. We're going to give you this. We're looking out for your interest. And wow.
Right. Well, they're the distraction of racism and anti-immigrant feelings to make us, those of us who are white, feel like that's the enemy, that that our jobs are being taken by, recent immigrants, for instance. And yet it's corporate executives that make decisions to move our jobs overseas because they can exploit people better in other countries. So we have to really understand, and that by understand racism, I mean understanding how we are being exploited, even if we're white, by this whole system. And racism is exactly what we need to address.
Right. There's a lot of talk going around about who voted for Trump. I'm going to just read this to you. It says, for example, in the 2016 presidential election, those who voted for Trump had a mean income of $72,000 per year, and nearly half had college degrees. They were solidly middle class. Yet many people assume Trump's supporters are uneducated, working class, and poor whites who were unable to really see what he stands for. That says a lot in this paragraph. And it reminds me of what I thought decades ago, that most white people think they're superior.
Mm-hmm. That's true, but I think that it's also true that it's clearly a ruling class agenda that middle class and upper class white people realize that they're going to be treated better than anybody else. And so Trump is a good option for them, they think. That's a very short-sighted option, but the message is, and the other thing that I think is really important to understand is how much misinformation people are fed, and how much the corporations, the same ruling class that's rigging the electoral system, is presenting the news, distorting the news, or not reporting what's really happening in ways that most of us don't have a good sense of actually who anybody stands for, or what's true or false, or what's going on here or elsewhere in the world. So our system is very broken on several levels, and it's not even about who's president. Trump can come and go, but what we have is a class system that's structured to give us a whole series of false options.
Wow. So true. When you started off, as we wrap up here, you say in your book, you are not responsible for having white skin or for being raised in a white-dominated racist society in which you have been trained to have particular responses to people of color. That reminds me of the Hulk, when people jammed him up after his death. I guess there was this incident where his daughter was going with a black person, and people was calling him out for his racism. He says, look, I grew up in that culture. That's basically what he said. But you say, however, you are responsible for how you respond to racism, which is what this book is about, which was what your book is about. And you can only do so consciously and effectively if you begin by realizing it makes a crucial difference that you are perceived to be and treated as white. That's basically what you were saying.
Right. That's the first step. There's several more steps, right? Then we have to think of how can we get together and first identify the racism in the schools that we are connected to, or the medical system, or the neighborhood, or the city policies, that we are part of these different institutions. And we have to be able to identify how racism is showing up in these different institutions.
So we probably could do a whole show on these solutions. So you're saying the first one is to identify the racism in the institutions. Give us a couple of more, please. You identify it, then what? Okay, we know. I mean, I guess they finally identified that Columbus they changed. Most states don't have Columbus Day anymore.
Uh-huh.
So I guess that was identification of, but there's so much. Now we're also fighting this erasure of real history.
Right. Well, and I think that we have to identify the racism around us in the institutions. But then the next step is coming together with other people to address that. If it's in our children's classrooms, then we have to come together with the teachers and other parents and the students to say, okay, how can we shift things? How can we change things so that students of color have equal opportunities, that all the students are getting a truthful education about our history and culture? If we're in a workplace and there's discrimination going on, we have to come together and challenge that with other people.
But, we're talking to Paul Kivel and looking at his book, How White People, Uprooting Racism, How White People Can Work for Racial Justice. And you're mentioning that, but some of these schools, they are comfortable with the changing of history. Like, I don't want to hear about that. I mean, so there's a battle within the battle, it seems like.
Absolutely. And there's going to be a lot of particularly white people who want to defend the benefits they're getting from being white and the benefits their children are getting from being white. So, change has always come from large-scale organizing, challenging the institutions in our society. We're in a particularly chaotic and uncertain, but white supremacy is still at the core of a lot of what's going on. And we're still being divided by kinds of anti-immigrant, anti-people of color, anti-trans and queer, anti-women policies, statements, and culture, that we have to overcome these differences and work together.
Very interesting. You know what? I realize that you cannot legislate morality and compassion. Some people are not going to like you, and that's okay. The problem is when they have the power to control or do something to me. So is it realistic that we try to come together? Or maybe we should just try to leave everybody alone. Do your thing, let me do my thing. I don't agree, but don't try to control me. And I think that's what some of the black leaders said back in the day, Malcolm X. He said separation. Marcus Garvey. But we're trying to legislate morality. You cannot do that. You see what happened to the civil rights legislation that lasts for a hot second and say, oh, hell no.
Mm-hmm.
So is there an alternative? When people, I heard the statement, I agree to disagree. But if you don't like me, I think Kwame Ture said this very eloquently. He said, if you don't like me, that's no problem. You can not like me. But when you have the power and you're influencing and doing things to me, then I have a problem. So how can we separate that, or how can we deal with that?
Well, I think that's crucial to understanding the different levels of racism, because you're right. People can have any opinions and thoughts that they want, but once they start taking advantage of somebody else by charging them higher prices for the same goods, or pushing them out of schools and out of the classroom, or denying them medical care or public services, then it's not a question of individual morality or thoughts. It's a question of looking at the institutional practices that allow that to happen.
Wow, go ahead.
Yeah, it takes change at a higher level than we're used to thinking about to actually begin to get at the roots of what we're up against.
Wow. That's Paul Kivel, his book, Uprooting Racism, How White People Can Work for Racial Justice. Is there talking points you want to wrap up? What talking points I might have missed in my questioning that you wanted to make sure that our audience hears?
I think the thing that I would like to leave you with is that often we, as white people, we think that this is an issue for people of color, that they're getting hurt or they're getting abused or they're getting whatever, but we're okay. And I think that what we have to realize is that this is about all of us, that the poverty in the white community, the poor educational system in our schools, the lack of national medical care for everybody, the pollution in neighborhoods of color, it doesn't stay in those communities. It comes into our water systems, our air, that we are affected deeply and undermined in our humanity and in our physical reality by racism. And unless we understand that our lives are also at stake in this, and we need to work with people of color to change things, then we're going to go down with everybody else because we're on a sinking ship.
Would you say that to the hardcore racists too? Say, I don't want to work around no black people. Would you say that to them too, or would you have a different message? I'm like, I don't even want to sit mine. No way.
Well, I think nobody's going to get out of this alive without working together on a large scale.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have to figure out ways to do that. Black people are organizing in all kinds of ways. It's white people that are always coming along behind. My message is for white people, not for black people.
Gotcha. So, yeah, I do recall back in the day there were attempts of black organizations to work with the Klan. Just, I think even during the UNIA, Marcus Garvey's organization, and he got really, I think that led to his demise because people said, no, you cannot talk to them. Also, there's evidence that Elijah Muhammad had Malcolm X talk with the Klan, not to love them, not to sit by the counter, but to say, okay, I don't like you, you don't like me. So how can we live together without killing each other? And I think that's part of it.
Right. We have to build those bridges. And my work is about how do we as white people get ready to be really responsible, accountable partners in those collective efforts.
Brother Paul, tell people how they can get in contact with you, please.
I have a website, paulkivel.com. And there's lots of resources there, information about my books and curricula and articles and exercises, work that we've done over the years. So that's the best way to be in contact.
So if you're a white person listening to this broadcast, www.paulkivel.com. That's PAULKIVEL.com. I see you also have ChristianHegemony.org. What is that?
I know that Christian dominance is a fundamental system of oppression in our society, and the roots of a lot of what's keeps us apart. And so I've written a book and maintained the website of resources for being able to understand and resist the power and privilege of Christian dominance in our society. And we can see it today so visibly in white Christian nationalism, Christian Supreme Court, Christian nationalists in public and national office. So there's a whole nother series of resources available around those issues.
Thank you so much, Paul Kivel, for being on Cut to the Chase. That was Paul Kivel, or is Paul Kivel, author of Uprooting Racism, How White People Can Work for Racial Justice and Living in the Shadow of the Cross. So we told you how to get to him. Check him out, support him, and let's make a better world. Thanks, Paul, for joining me.
Thank you. It's great to be part of the conversation.